It was still half dark when the call came. I almost ignored it. An unknown number. No caller ID, but something in my gut told me to pick up. 10 minutes later, I was standing by the old drainage ditch that runs behind the abandoned highway outside Clay Hill. The air smelled of rain and rust. Then I saw him. My son, Ethan. He was crumpled near the culvert, soaked through his shirt, ripped open, his face bruised until I could barely recognize him. The sight froze me. For a heartbeat, I forgot how to breathe. When I knelt beside him, his body was ice cold. I kept calling his name over and over until he stirred and his lips moved just enough to push out 4 words that will never leave me. It was Sophie. At first, I thought the trauma made him delirious. Sophie, his wife, my daughter-in-law, couldn't possibly be part of this. She came from money, yes, but she'd always been polite, gentle, the kind of woman who brought wine to Thanksgiving and asked about my chickens like she really cared. But in that muddy ditch, staring at my son's broken face, nothing made sense anymore. I pressed my hands against his wounds, whispering that he was safe, that help was coming, though I didn't even know who to call. The world around us felt hollow, just the hum of crickets, the far-off wail of a train, and my heartbeat pounding in my ears. My mind raced between panic and denial. Who could do this to him, and why would he say her name? When the paramedics arrived, their flashlights sliced through the dark, bright and merciless. One of them, a woman about my age, touched my arm and said gently, "Ma'am, please step back." But I couldn't move. I needed Ethan to know I was there, that I hadn't failed him. I kept repeating that we'd figure it out, that nobody would hurt him again. Inside, though, a different truth burned. I didn't believe my own words. That night changed everything. The smell of wet soil, the red streaks of blood, mixing with rainwater, his voice saying, "Offie." It all replayed like a loop I couldn't turn off. I'd always thought evil was something distant, something that happened on the news to strangers in another town. But when you find your own child dumped like garbage, you realize evil isn't far away. Sometimes it's sitting across from you at Sunday dinner. And deep down, I already knew this wasn't random. Whoever did this wanted to send a message. The only question was why. Before that night, my life was quiet, predictable even. I'm 63, and I've lived in the same small house on the edge of Clay Hill for over 30 years. The paint's faded in spots, the porch swings when the wind picks up. But it's home. My days used to start before sunrise. I'd brew a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead roll-out biscuit dough and hum old gospel tunes while the hens out back started clucking for their feed. There was peace in that rhythm. The smell of warm bread, the sound of the radio playing country hits from the 90s, the same neighbor walking her dog past my gate every morning. After losing my husband a decade ago, I'd found comfort in simple routines. Life didn't have many surprises left, and honestly, I was fine with that. The only part of my day that ever broke the pattern was when I thought about my son, Ethan. He'd always been ambitious, restless, born with that spark that made him believe he could be more than what life had handed him. He studied hard, got himself into a decent college, and landed a job downtown in one of those glass buildings where people wear suits that cost more than my monthly groceries. He was proud of it, and I was proud of him. But sometimes when I watched him straighten his tie or check his reflection before heading to work, I worried he was building a life too far away from the kind of world we came from. He'd gone from dirt roads to marble floors, from second-hand jeans to tailored jackets. And then came Sophie. Sophie Grant was beautiful. The kind of girl who looked like she belonged in magazines, polished, confident, with that effortless grace only people born into money seem to have. Her father, Richard Grant, owned half the town's construction projects and a chain of luxury restaurants. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room and silence it. Not because he was charming, but because everyone knew he could make or break them with a single phone call. When Ethan told me he was marrying Sophie, I remember smiling, hugging him, saying all the right things a mother should. But inside, I felt something tighten, not jealousy, not even fear. Just a quiet knowing that love doesn't always bridge the gap between two worlds. I'd seen it before. Folks from money and folks from struggle don't always see the world through the same window. To her, ambition might have meant success and social grace. To us, it meant survival. And survival has a different price tag. Still, when I first met her, she seemed genuinely kind. She offered to help me sell pies at the farmer's market, even tried to pet my old rooster before it nearly pecked her shoe. She laughed it off, said it reminded her of visiting her grandfather's estate as a child. For a while, I believed they'd make it work, that maybe love was stronger than class, stronger than pride. Looking back now, I realize that peace can sometimes be the most dangerous illusion. You think the storm's far away until you feel the first drop of rain on your skin. That's how it was with Ethan and Sophie. They looked perfect from the outside, handsome couple picture book smiles, but underneath, something was cracking. And when it finally broke, it didn't just split them apart. It shattered everything around them. The morning after I found Ethan, the world Betrayal didn't feel real. The hospital smelled like bleach and broken hope. Machines beeped beside his bed in a slow, steady rhythm that almost sounded like mercy. His face was swollen, his ribs wrapped tight, and even breathing looked like work. I kept my hands folded in my lap because touching him made the bruises look worse, and I couldn't bear to be the one to add more pain. The nurse told me it was a miracle he was alive. They'd said he'd been hit by a car, another unfortunate accident on the county road. But mothers know when a story doesn't fit. His wounds weren't the kind a bumper leaves. These were the kind left by fists and boots. I'd seen that kind of damage once before, back when my brother worked security and came home after breaking up bar fights. You can tell the difference between a crash and a beating. One is chaos. The other is intention. Later that afternoon, my phone rang again. The number was blocked, but I answered anyway. A man's voice, low-polished and sharp as glass, said, "You should remind your son where he comes from. Not everyone can climb too high without falling." Then the line went dead. My stomach dropped. There was no name, but I didn't need one. I knew that tone. I'd heard it at Ethan and Sophie's wedding, buried beneath a toast that sounded like a compliment, but felt like a warning. Richard Grant. Sophie's father was a man who smiled with his mouth, but never with his eyes. Even when he'd shaken my hand, his grip felt like a test. Now that same voice was telling me my son's accident wasn't an accident at all. I sat there staring at the wall, piecing it together. Ethan had mentioned an argument weeks earlier, something about Richard offering him money to make things easier for Sophie. I didn't ask details then because I wanted to believe that family meant decency, but I should have known better. Power doesn't like to be questioned, and pride doesn't tolerate defiance. That night, I drove home from the hospital under a sky heavy with rain. My headlights caught the ditch where I'd found Ethan just a day before. The dirt was still dark with blood, the grass flattened where he'd crawled. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and I could feel anger burning through the fear. Not the kind of anger that makes you reckless, but the kind that makes you quiet, focused. Richard Grant wanted to send a message, and I'd received it loud and clear: stay in your place. But he'd forgotten something about people like me. When you've had to fight your whole life just to keep a roof over your head and a child fed, you don't scare easy. You learn that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about knowing when to stop being afraid. So I decided right there in that rain that I wasn't going to let this end in silence. He thought he'd buried his warning in my son's blood. He didn't realize he'd just awakened something much stronger. Ethan sat on the edge of his hospital bed, his head down, eyes blank. The light from the window hit his face in a way that made him look older than he was, like life had taken something from him that he couldn't get back. He barely spoke, and when he did, his words carried a kind of quiet surrender that broke my heart. He whispered that the police wouldn't help, said they were already in Richard Grant's pocket. The man's money reached everywhere from the courthouse to the sheriff's office. "There's no point, Mom," Ethan muttered. "He owns everything." Hearing that from my son, the same boy who used to talk about justice like it was sacred, hurt more than seeing his bruises. It wasn't just his body that was broken. It was his belief in fairness. But I wasn't ready to give up. Maybe I didn't have power or wealth, but I had something stronger: memory. I could still hear my mother's voice in my head, soft but firm from all those years ago. She used to say, "Rich folks think poor folks don't keep records, that we're too busy surviving to notice things. But we see, we hear, and when the time comes, we remember." That thought anchored me. My mama had lived her life cleaning other people's houses, raising me to believe that truth was its own kind of weapon. She'd seen men like Richard before, men who thought the world spun around their last name. But she'd also seen them fall, usually at the hands of people they thought were beneath them. So instead of sitting there in that cold hospital room, waiting for justice to find us, I decided to go after it myself. I didn't know where to start, but I knew who would. My older brother, Frank Cooper. Frank and I hadn't talked much since our mother passed. He'd moved 3 towns over and kept to himself, working as a freelance accountant. But I remembered how sharp he was, how he used to spot numbers that didn't add up even when everyone else missed them. Before retiring, he'd helped uncover a few shady contracts at a construction firm, the kind of work that made him more enemies than friends. If anyone could help me trace Richard Grant's mess, it was Frank. I called him that night. He picked up on the 3rd ring, same gruff voice I remembered from childhood. "Linda," he said, cautious, like the past 10 years hung between us. "I need your help," I told him. "It's about Ethan. About the Grants." There was silence, just the sound of his breathing. Then a sigh that carried both weariness and resolve. "All right," he said. "Tell me everything." And for the first time since that night by the ditch, I felt something close to hope. It wasn't bright or loud, it was quiet, like a spark inside a storm. But it was enough. Because while Richard Grant had his money, his men and his influence, I had something he'd never understand. A family that refused to kneel. And with Frank by my side, I knew one thing for sure. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The knock on my door came just after sunset. When I opened it, Sophie stood there, mascara streaked down her cheeks, trembling like a leaf in the wind. The polished, composed woman I once knew was gone. In her place stood someone terrified and broken. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, clutching a small purse to her chest. Her voice shook as she spoke. "Linda, I didn't know what my father planned. I swear I didn't. I wanted to believe her, but trust doesn't come easy when your son's lying in a hospital bed because of her family." She reached into the purse and pulled out a small envelope, setting it on my kitchen table like it was poison. Inside were printed photos, Ethan beaten and bleeding, lying in that same ditch. There were receipts, 2 marked with transfers to a name I didn't recognize, the Crow. My hands trembled as I went through the papers. Sophie explained between sobs that her father had hired the Crow, a group of men who handled dirty work for powerful people. She'd overheard him talking on the phone about disciplining someone who'd forgotten their place. It wasn't until she saw the transfer herself that she realized the target was Ethan. But there was something else, another layer that chilled me even deeper. The photos weren't taken by the attackers. The angles, the clarity, it looked like someone else had been watching from the shadows. Someone who wanted proof. Someone who might now be holding the evidence that could destroy Richard Grant. Sophie noticed it too. He doesn't know who took those, she whispered, and that scares him. My father doesn't like loose ends. I studied her face. The guilt there wasn't fake. She looked like a woman torn between loyalty and conscience, trapped in the no man's land where blood ties and love collide. Maybe she had grown up obeying power, but love, real love, was teaching her rebellion. You can walk away from him, Sophie, I said quietly. But once you do, you'll have to keep walking, because a man like your father doesn't forgive. Her eyes met mine, red but resolute. Then I'll keep walking. I can't be part of this anymore. For the first time since the nightmare began, I saw a crack in Richard Grant's perfect armor, his own daughter. She had the money trail, the pictures, the voice to expose him. But more than that, she had fear on her side. And when fear changes sides, power begins to crumble. As she left that night, I realized something: the people who live in shadows are never as invisible as they think. Someone had seen what happened to Ethan. Someone had recorded it. And that meant the truth was out there, waiting for its moment. And I was going to find it. Frank arrived at my house the next morning before sunrise, still smelling faintly of old coffee and engine oil from the drive. He looked older than I remembered, his shoulders heavier, but his eyes were sharp as ever. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Mama used to knead dough on Sunday mornings, and I told him everything about Ethan, about Richard Grant, about Sophie's confession and the mysterious photos. He didn't interrupt. Frank was the kind of man who listened all the way through before forming a thought. When I finished, he took a long breath, rubbed his jaw, and said quietly, "Then it's time to open the box." For a moment, I didn't understand. "What box?" I asked. He gave me that look older brothers give when they think you should already know. "Mama's iron box," he said. "The one she kept in the attic, wrapped in that old quilt. She always said it held memories worth keeping." "You never wondered what that meant?" "Of course I had. But after Mama died, I couldn't bring myself to open it. It felt sacred, like touching it might disturb her rest. I thought it was full of family mementos, maybe a few faded photos, her church letters. Nothing more." Frank shook his head. "Linda Mama wasn't just a housekeeper. She worked in the Grant estate for years. She saw everything: the land deals, the fake contracts, the people they pushed out. She kept records because she knew one day someone would have to make it right." That hit me hard. I remembered how Mama used to come home with quiet anger in her eyes after long days cleaning their mansion. Once, when I was little, she told me, "Some houses aren't homes, Linda. They're cages made of gold." I never understood what she meant, not until now. We climbed up to the attic together. The air was thick with dust and memory. In the far corner, beneath old quilts and boxes of Christmas decorations, sat a small metal chest, rusted at the hinges, but still locked tight. My hands shook as I lifted it down. The key had hung on a string behind Mama's photo frame all these years. When the lock finally clicked open, the smell of old paper and iron filled the air. Inside were stacks of neatly folded documents, photos, and a small notebook bound in leather. The first page stopped me cold. It was Mama's handwriting, elegant but firm. "If you're reading this, the truth has found its time." We spent hours going through the contents. There were property maps from the 1960s, lists of families who'd been forced to sell their land for pennies, and letters that described how the original Grant patriarch used threats and bribes to build his empire. Photos showed people standing in front of their homes. Poor families, farmers, widows, all of whom vanished from public record shortly after those deals were made. By the time we finished, the weight of what we'd found filled the room like smoke. Frank leaned back and said, "They didn't build an empire. They buried one under other people's lives." I ran my fingers across one of the old photographs. A family of 5 smiling in front of a farmhouse I'd passed 100 times as a girl. That land was now part of the Grant Development District, where shiny restaurants and office towers stood. My stomach turned. It hit me then that the story of the Grants wasn't about business or legacy. It was about theft, fear, and silence. A silence that my mother had refused to accept. I looked at Frank and said what we were both thinking. "It's time to finish what Mama started." He nodded. "Then we'll do it the same way she did, by using their own records against them." In that moment, I realized something bigger than revenge was unfolding. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about every person who had been erased so men like Richard Grant could stand taller. Mama had left us the truth. Now it was our turn to make sure it finally spoke. It was close to midnight when someone knocked on my door. I almost didn't answer. Out here after dark, unexpected visitors rarely bring good news. But something about the sound, steady, deliberate, made me look through the window. A man stood outside in the rain, tall shoulders hunched, a baseball cap pulled low. He wasn't moving, just waiting. I cracked the door open an inch and called out, "Who is it?" The man lifted his head. The porch light hit his face, and for a moment I couldn't place him. Then he said, "My name's Damon Ross. I used to work for Richard Grant." The air left my chest. I didn't know if he was a threat or a warning. His voice was gravelly tired, like someone who hadn't slept right in years. I motioned him inside, just far enough to stand out of the rain, and kept my hand close to my phone. He handed me a thick envelope. "I can't carry this anymore," he said quietly. "What's in there will tell you what kind of man Richard really is, what he's done, and what he's planning next." I stared at the envelope, feeling its weight. When I asked why he was giving it to me, Damon looked down at his hands. "Because I was one of the men who helped him clean up his problems," he said. "People who wouldn't sell, who wouldn't stay quiet. I didn't know who most of them were, just names on a list. But I know what happened to them after we visited." The room went still. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. I opened the envelope with shaking fingers. Inside were photographs, bank statements, and a small flash drive. One of the photos showed a familiar road sign, Clay Hill Road, and beneath it, a car half hidden in a ditch. My stomach turned. He went on his words. Slow, heavy. "Richard's lost control. That's why I left. But before I did, I heard something you need to know. He's hired someone new. Calls him the Fixer. The man's being paid to erase what's left of this mess, and that includes you, your son, and anyone helping you. He's giving him 48 hours. I felt the blood drain from my face. For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. Damon looked at me with guilt written all over his expression. "I can't undo what I've done," he said. "But maybe this can help you stop him." Frank appeared in the doorway, then shotgun in hand, eyes narrowed. He didn't say a word. Just studied Damon. The man didn't flinch. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said. "You can check the drive. You'll find recordings of Richard's meetings, deals, threats, payments, everything." Frank nodded once, still holding the gun, but I could see his mind working, counting hours, weighing risk. I took the flash drive from Damon's hand. It was small, almost nothing to look at, but it felt like holding a loaded weapon. Before leaving, Damon paused at the door. "You should know," he said, "the fixer doesn't take jobs he can't finish. If you're gonna move, move fast." Then he disappeared into the rain, swallowed by the darkness he'd come from. When the door shut, I locked it and leaned against the wall, the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Frank looked at me and said quietly, 48 hours isn't long." "No," I replied, staring at the envelope on the table. "But it's long enough to end this." And as the rain hammered the windows, I realized what Mama meant when she used to say, "Truth hides in the dark until someone's brave enough to turn on the light." The light was on now, and there was no turning it off. The plan came together in whispers and half-lit rooms, the kind of conversations you don't write down and don't repeat. We didn't have time for mistakes. Damon's warning had given us 48 hours before the fixer would come looking for us, and in a town like Clay Hill, that wasn't enough time to hide. So instead of running, we decided to bring the storm straight to Richard Grant. It was Frank who first said it. "If he thinks he's the hunter, make him walk into the trap." The rest of us just stared at him, knowing he meant it literally. That's how St. Mary's Church became our battlefield. The church sat on the edge of town, half forgotten and always quiet. My mother used to sing there when I was a child, back when faith felt simple. Now the same building that once held Sunday prayers would hold the truth every lie Richard had buried, would echo off those stone walls before the night was over. We had help. Troy Ross Damon's younger brother reached out the next morning. He still worked for Richard, but said he'd been looking for a way out since the day his brother disappeared. You could see the conflict in his face, a man who'd done wrong but was finally ready to do something right. He offered to make the call that would draw Richard out. "He trusts me," Troy said. "If I tell him I've found Sophie, and she's ready to deal, he'll come. He never sends someone else to clean up family business." Frank and I exchanged a look. It was risky, but it made sense. Troy would pretend to have Sophie hiding in the church, waiting with the evidence we'd gathered. Richard would come to silence her himself, and that's when we'd record everything. By noon, Frank and I had set up tiny cameras along the church pews and hidden a microphone under the altar. Sophie handled contacting the prosecutor's office and a local investigative journalist she'd met through her charity work. She didn't tell them much, only that there was going to be a meeting they'd want to see for themselves. The rest of the setup went quietly, too quietly. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees, the old church looked like something out of a painting. The wooden door creaked when we pushed it open, the air heavy with dust and candle wax. Ethan stood near the back with a phone in hand, ready to stream everything live if something went wrong. My heart pounded so loud, I thought Richard might hear it miles away. Troy made the call. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "I've got her," he said. "She's scared, but she's ready to talk. She wants to meet where it all started, St. Mary's, tonight." There was a pause on the other end. Then Richard's voice came through cold and certain. "Good. Don't let anyone else know. I'll handle this myself." When the line went dead, none of us spoke. We just waited, listening to the sound of the wind pushing through the cracked windows. Every minute felt like an hour. Sophie's hands shook, and I reached over to steady them. "It's almost over," I whispered. "One way or another." About 30 minutes later, we saw headlights sweep across the churchyard. A black SUV rolled up, sleek and silent. Richard Grant stepped out wearing the same calm expression he always did when he thought he was in control. He didn't bring bodyguards this time. He didn't need them, or so he thought. As his footsteps echoed up the aisle, I could almost feel my mother's presence in that church. The memory of her voice rising from somewhere deep inside me. This was her justice too. Every secret she'd kept, every truth she'd written down, had led us here. Frank's hand rested on the recorder in his pocket. Ethan's phone light blinked once live. The cameras were rolling, the trap was set. And as Richard approached the altar, the man who'd built an empire on other people's silence was about to hear something he hadn't heard in years, the sound of his own lies catching up to him. The sound of Richard's shoes against the church floor was slow and deliberate, each step echoing through the empty hall like a countdown. The air inside St. Mary's felt thick, charged with something that wasn't just fear. It was the weight of years of lies pressing down, finally about to break. He walked in with his head high, the arrogance of a man who had always gotten his way. Even in the dim light, his white linen suit seemed to shine. Behind the calm smile on his face was the certainty of someone who believed he controlled everyone in the room. He thought this was going to be an easy cleanup, one last act of dominance before disappearing into the night. I watched him from behind the altar curtain, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Sophie stood beside me, trembling but holding her ground. Her eyes were wet but fierce. She was ready to face the man who had destroyed so many lives, including her own childhood. Richard stopped halfway down the aisle and called out, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "Sophie, come out, let's end this nonsense. You've embarrassed me enough already." His tone wasn't angry yet. It was the voice of a man still convinced that control was his birthright. Troy played his part, perfectly, pretending to be the obedient servant. "She's here, sir," he said from the shadows. She wanted to talk first. "Says she's sorry." That was all Richard needed to hear. He smirked, straightened his jacket, and walked closer to the altar. "Good," he muttered. "At least she still knows her place. Let's get this over with before anyone notices I'm gone." The microphones hidden under the pews picked up every word. The cameras we'd placed behind the candles blinked silently, recording every movement. Richard began to pace. "You think love excuses betrayal?" he said bitterly, more to himself than to anyone else. "That boy of yours? What's his name?" "Ethan. He thought he could steal my daughter, my reputation, my legacy. I warned him, but he didn't listen. So I had to remind him who holds power in this town." Sophie covered her mouth to stop a sob. The cameras caught the moment his mask began to crack, the ease with which cruelty came out of him. And now he said, his voice dropping lower, "I'll do what I should have done from the beginning. I'll make sure no one ever forgets what happens to people who defy me." Then he paused and turned toward the shadows, his eyes glinting. "Bring my daughter forward. Let her see what betrayal costs." That was the moment. Frank gave me a small nod and pressed the signal on his phone. In the next breath, the sound of tires screeched outside. Doors slammed. Heavy footsteps rushed in. The church doors burst open, and the echo of authority filled the air. "Richard Grant." A voice called firm and official, "You are under arrest for multiple counts of conspiracy, assault, and obstruction of justice." The agents moved fast, surrounding him before he could react. A camera crew followed close behind, led by the investigative reporter Sophie had called earlier. The red light on her mic blinked bright as she whispered to her cameraman, "We've got everything." Richard spun around, his face pale with disbelief. "This is a mistake," he barked. "You can't do this to me. I run this town." Frank stepped out from behind the altar recorder still running. "Not anymore," he said quietly. For the first time, Richard's voice shook. He looked around, realizing he was surrounded. His secrets exposed, his power shattered. "Sophie," he pleaded. "Tell them this is a misunderstanding. You're my daughter. You owe me that." Sophie stepped into the light, her chin high, despite the tears on her face. "No, Father," she said softly. "What I owe you is the truth. and tonight, the whole world will hear it. The lead officer read him his rights as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. The arrogance drained from him like colour fading from a photograph. The cameras kept rolling as he was led down the aisle, shouting threats that no one believed anymore. The church, once his stage, had become his prison. As they took him away, I felt a strange calm wash over me. Not joy, not vengeance, just release. The man who thought he could buy silence had finally been forced to speak his truth in front of everyone. And for the first time in a long time, Clay Hill felt like it could finally breathe again. The courthouse smelled of dust and coffee that morning, the kind of air that clings to long days and longer years. When the judge read the verdict, the room went silent. Richard Grant. Once the man who ruled over Clay Hill like a self-made king, was sentenced to life in federal prison. No appeals, no fancy loopholes, no quiet deals behind closed doors. The empire he built on fear and broken families finally came crashing down. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds. It wasn't dramatic or loud, just a soft light spreading over the courthouse steps, the kind that makes you stop and breathe. For the first time in years, this town could breathe again. Richard's properties were seized, his accounts frozen. The court ruled that what had been taken by greed would be returned in justice. Families who had lost everything to his manipulations were given their land back. Scholarships were funded in the names of those who had disappeared. And part of his estate was used to build a new community clinic, one that would treat anyone regardless of what they could pay. That clinic became a symbol of something none of us could quite put into words: redemption. Not for Richard, but for everyone he'd hurt. Months later, life began to look different. Ethan recovered fully, his limp gone, but his scars still visible, a reminder of what we'd survived. Sophie, no longer haunted by her father's shadow, smiled again. A real smile this time, the kind that reached her eyes. They decided to marry again. Not out of ceremony, but out of renewal. The wedding took place in my backyard under the pecan tree my late husband planted decades ago. There were no tuxedos or photographers, just family neighbors and the sweet smell of biscuits cooling on the porch. Sophie wore a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, and Ethan couldn't stop looking at her like he was still surprised she was real. A year later, their first child was born. A baby girl with her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn smile. They named her Grace. The day they brought her home, I held that tiny bundle against my chest, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. It reminded me of something my mother once told me. Justice doesn't need wealth, it just needs courage. I told Grace the same thing, even though she was too young to understand. One day she will. Sometimes late at night, I sit on the porch with a cup of tea and listen to the quiet hum of the town. The same streets that once trembled under Richard's influence now buzz with laughter music and the sound of children playing after dark. That's what victory really looks like. Not headlines, not applause, but ordinary peace returning to ordinary lives. We never set out to be heroes. We were just a family that refused to stay silent. But sometimes that's all it takes to change everything, a few people brave enough to say enough. So let me ask you something, from one parent to another, from one soul to another. If it were your child, if the people in power threatened what you love most, would you have the courage to fight back? Because that's what justice truly is. Not a system, not a courtroom, but the quiet, unshakable choice to stand up when it matters most.